We are here this morning at one of the most famous sport fishing destinations in the world, Bud & Mary's. It is home to some of the finest offshore fishing captains, backcountry guides. This morning we are going to talk with the man whose heart is embedded into the marina. It is such a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you for letting us come into your office this morning and talk with you about your very long fishing career, Richard.
Well, Jenna, it's wonderful to be here with you. And at my age, not too many people are asking me questions about my life any longer.
Well, I want to know all about it this morning. And Richard, you were definitely born with fishing in your blood. Take me back to when your career first started.
In order to be the type of fisherman that I am, and real fishermen will relate to it, it's got to be in your blood. And it's funny, in my earliest memories, my grandfather, my first experience with fishing, I was about 3 years old, and my grandfather took me to a lake in Missouri, and they wouldn't let me use a mechanical rod. They insisted I use a cane pole and fish on the opposite side of the dock where all the fish were being caught. Somehow or another, I got lucky and pulled this big bass out, and my grandfather paraded me around the lake, showing me and the fish off. I believe that was the first time in my life I ever really got any real merit and recognition. And I think my desire for fishing was born then, right then, yeah.
And then it just took off from that moment, Richard.
You know, it's interesting, hard to really explain it, but my grandfather actually played a big role in my fishing life because he had a passion for fishing as well. And my father and my mother and myself, we all moved to Miami right around 1949. And what ended up happening is we wound up living on a canal. And my grandfather used to come down 2 times a year, and my father got me a little boat, a little 8-foot pram with a 1938 Evinrude engine on it. And I used to start fishing in the canal, and from the canal I ventured out to the bay, and from the bay out to the ocean, ultimately winding up in the Bahamas, where I fished a lot of my youth and things like that. But you know, it's very strange because you know, my love and passion for fishing, I ended up going to the University of Miami, where I graduated with an accounting degree and actually went to work when I was about 21 years old with a medium-sized CPA firm. And what was strange is my grandfather not only introduced me to fishing, but he did something really unusual that I never really recognized until later in life. My grandfather was a very successful business person and insisted that I get this education. And when my grandfather was dying, I was about 21 years of age, working for that accounting firm, I went to visit him for the last time in Missouri. And what was so strange is I went in, told him I had graduated with this accounting degree and had worked for the CPA firm. At that time, my grandfather was a diminished state where he could not speak. He had actually a tube. And he picked up a chalkboard and he wrote on it, "Why the hell do you want to do that?" And you know, as a 22-year-old young man who had thought I had fallen into what his ambitions for me was, I never understood it. But what ended up happening was strange. It was a freeing experience, a very freeing experience. And I remember not too long after that calling my mother first, telling her I was quitting my accounting job, calling my boss at the accounting firm, telling him I was quitting. My mother cried, my accounting boss was in disbelief. And from there I actually ended up going into a bar and restaurant business, which facilitated me to be able to buy a charter boat, which I ultimately ran a famous old dock in Miami called Pier 5. And you know, if you know anything about Miami's history, that's where real sport fishing's history started, back there in the 1920s. So as I look back and think about it, yeah, it was my grandfather that introduced me and kept me in it. And you know, he insisted I have that education. You know, as interesting as it is today, when you walked in, I still do the accounting for this business, so it's a valuable thing to have. But at the same time, fishing was in my blood.
I think you made the right move by doing that too, Richard. And now your fishing career, it's been amazing. You've had so many highlights throughout your career. Talk with me about some of the ones that you really can't forget about.
There are certain things, you know, memorable things, and you know, it actually started way back at Pier 5. You know, I discovered a virgin wreck one time, and I caught 130 Warsaw groupers off of it when nobody caught Warsaw groupers because they were practically extinct. But you know, it's interesting, leaving Pier 5 and going through this other thing. I moved to Alaska for a short time, went in the mining business, and I came back here around 1978, and of course, fortunately, through a lot of luck, a lot of coincidence, I was able to purchase this marina. And you know, it's strange because my real roots of fishing were blue water fishing, and you know, they still are to this day. I love blue water fishing. But I spent about 25 years of my life chasing a little fish called a bonefish, which in my early life I used to use as bait. But after I realized just how challenging and just how difficult they were to capture and just how exciting they were, you know, I had several things. One of the things I had happen is I was the guide to that fish over there, which is a 14-pound, 6-ounce world record bonefish on a fly rod. And that was one of the real serious highlights, you know, of my life. Interestingly enough, the angler that I caught that with was a guy named Captain Vic Gaspenny. He and I have been fishing together 48 years. He was the angler, I was the guide. So that bonefish stood out. But it's ironic because, you know, my real legacy, I guess, so to speak, is going to be something completely different. Because I went from bonefishing in 6 inches of water to fishing in 2,000 feet of water for the broadbill swordfish. And it's a long, lengthy story, but my history with broadbill swordfishing actually started in Miami at Pier 5 when they were first discovered at night. I was part of the group that was fishing for them when they first discovered them. But what had happened is I came down here, the bone fishing in this particular area began to get more difficult and actually became very diminished. And it was right during 9/11 that we decided, Vic Gaspenny and myself urging me, to go out and see if the population of swordfish had actually recovered. Because the long lining, after they discovered them in the Straits of Florida at night during the 1970s, had diminished the stocks completely, and they had eliminated long lining. So we went out, we started it at night, and before you knew it, we had this idea to do it during the daytime, and I actually ended up catching about 200 broadbill swordfish before anybody found out. It's now spread, that particular discovery, throughout the entire globe. What's even more interesting is that I've actually passed it on to my younger son, who is now much better known than I am in the fishing world, and his thing is broadbill swordfish, and he's gone to Texas and done seminars. He's gone all over the world, actually, as far as Australia, you know, and introduced and implemented, if you will, these different techniques, you know, that we pioneered right here, you know, off the shores of Islamorada. So I guess, you know, the bone fishing and the sword fishing, you know, those were the two things, the two highlights, if you will, that stand out in my mind.
You definitely can't forget about those highlights. I've enjoyed looking at the photos. Some of these swordfish, they're unreal to an Indiana girl.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. There are two old characters, you know, that come to mind. One is Ernest Hemingway, as we all know, and I had the privilege in that picture of going to Cuba and actually spending time with his boat captain. That's Gregorio Fuentes. He was 100 when you see me there. And that's in Cuba, a little town called Cujimar, depending on how you pronounce it. And that rod I'm holding is Hemingway's last rod. And interestingly enough, he shared information with me that led me to understand these swordfish and played into this, if you will, pioneering of broadbill swordfish. And what's really interesting is the fact that Hemingway, the story, of course, which stands out that he wrote, the one that, you know, of course, he won the Pulitzer for, is The Old Man of the Sea. And what I know about that through my experiences with Gregorio is that that wasn't a marlin. What had happened is there was an old Cuban fisherman that was fishing, a friend of Gregorio's, with a hand line. And at daylight, when they went out, you know, game fishing, he and Hemingway, Gregorio and Hemingway, they stumbled on this old fisherman battling a fish at daylight, which was a monster swordfish. So it's kind of cool to know that.
That's very cool. Richard, you have some unforgettable memories on the sea, and of course you have so many unforgettable memories here at Bud and Mary's. This place, it's definitely in your heart and soul, Richard, and you have decided to keep it alive.
I went through a big transformation in my life. About 25 years ago, I decided to give up alcohol and other mind-altering substances, including mind-altering women. So you know, it was a thing that had a profound effect on me, and I was really blessed with two beautiful children. Two beautiful children, one of which, by the way, attended the University of Miami, and the other one, Ricky, the older boy. And my older boy fishes in the backcountry, and my younger boy fishes offshore. And each of them, in their own right, are very well established in this sport fishing world. But it's kind of strange, you know, if you look at this piece, this is, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago, maybe a little more now. The Miami Herald decided to come down here, and basically that's the cover of the financial section. And what had happened, as many of you may know, is there was this tremendous bubble that existed in property values. And you know, sometimes in life, people can be tempted. They can be tempted, as I have been in my life. And what they did is they dangled this carrot in front of me. a lot of money to sell out. The thought of all that money, you know, and that temptation, you know. And my son Nicholas, the younger boy, was going to UM at the time, University of Miami, and he got wind of it. And he came home, and I sat with him, and he looked at me and honestly said with tears in his eyes, "Dad, my God, you cannot do this thing. You have 47 families, fishing guides, captains, their livelihood, your employees. How can you even entertain the idea of selling Bud and Mary's?" And you know, I looked at him, and I tell you truthfully, I almost felt an overwhelming sense of guilt that I even entertained that idea. But you know, fate's funny, because you know, after that particular decision, and this is how life can be, I was really tested, because you know, the next thing that happened is the fuel prices shot through the roof. And you know, when you're running these big diesel powered boats, you know, you can only demand so much money to take people charter fishing. And when the prices of fuel shot up that high, I was really concerned that our charter fleet literally might not be able to go on. And the next thing I know after that, we had a series of hurricanes, you may remember, 2005, 2006. And you know, it's funny, they didn't come over the top of Bud and Mary's, but they took away the docks, they took away the electric, they took away the fill, they shut down the business. It was horrific. And then after that, we had this thing as a result of that bubble. I think they called it a recession, closer to a depression, and our tourism really dropped. And if that weren't bad enough, our biggest resort in town burnt to the ground. And then a final touch was oil coming out of this oil well in the Gulf, and all I could envision was the entire place covered and coated in oil. And I'm thinking to myself, what have I done? But you know, as I sit here today, you know what I've done? I relied on faith more than material things. And you know, I can't tell you how much, you know, how thankful, how grateful I am to still be involved. I've taken, you know, advantage of the gifting process and what have you, and the kids now own it, and I work for them. And by the way, I work harder for them than I did for myself. And the two of them each have a passion and a love, and they weren't forced into this thing. As I said, Ricky, my older son, is a backcountry guide and quite accomplished. My son Nick, he's a little more better known, and again, you know, as good an offshore fisherman as I think exists in the world. And so, you know, I'm going to do the rest of my time here, you know, and I hope I'll maintain my health. And I have never lost my passion for fishing. I've been as excited today as I ever was, and I hope it continues, and I know it will.
Well, I think you made the right decision by keeping this place alive, because you are sharing that passion that you have with so many others. And Richard, it has been a pleasure hearing your story this morning. The next time I'm at Bud and Mary's, I'll have to go out on the fishing boat with you.
Oh, you certainly should.
Richard, thank you again for your time today.
Thank you so much, Jenna, for asking me. You know, it helps.